All right, folks, uh, it's getting a little later in the season, and we are going to talk about harvesting. So let's begin. There are different types of crops, and there are different harvesting techniques for pretty much every single variety of every single crop. So it can get pretty complicated. So we're going to be trying to talk about things in pretty general terms, but we can break up the types of crops into a few groups. There are fruit crops. There are leaf or head producing crops, which could be like cabbages and lettuces. There are root, tuber, and root-like crops. So not every root-like crop is a root crop. Think of, for example, kohlrabi. Kohlrabi is a root-like crop, but it actually grows just above the ground. Celeriac would be another example. Stem crops. Stem crops are things like celery, rhubarb, shoot and bud crops. So shoot and bud crops are things like asparagus are shoots of a plant. Um, Brussels sprouts are buds of a plant. And then there are all the seed crops, everything from sunflower seeds to dry beans to wheat and corn and rice, flowers, and on and on and on. So many types of crops. So factors that we want to think about when we are talking about harvesting, we need to pay a lot of attention to kind of these four main things. One is harvesting at the right time. So that means learning how to judge the maturity of the crop, which is a little bit different than the ripeness and the tenderness, etc. Again, it depends on what your crop is that you're harvesting. Second thing, we always want to remember that we're trying to protect not only the produce, which is the fruit or the vegetable that we're harvesting, but also the plant. If it's a plant that we are going to come back and harvest from later, we want to protect the plant too. Some plants you harvest them one time and then you don't have to protect the plant because you're basically killing it when you harvest it, like a head of lettuce. But other plants, you want to be careful not to hurt the plant when you're harvesting. Third thing, for continued harvest plants, we want to pick at the correct stage every few days. We want to be consistent with that harvesting because we want to be consistent and thorough with that harvesting, because if we're not, then what will happen is mature seeds will form and the plant will kind of go downhill health-wise because it's putting all its energy into making seed. A perfect example of that is green beans or peas, any kind of peas. If they make mature seeds, then it will spell the end for that plant. And the last thing is we want to be practical and efficient. Okay, so we'll get into the details of all these. So harvesting at the right time, what that means, well, first we want to understand there's this word maturity. And when we're talking about plants and crops, maturity is just kind of a general term, and it means when it's at full growth and readiness. It's a non-specific term, but it means that something's ready when it's mature. It's completed its growth process and it's mature, whatever that means. So another term that does have a little bit more specific definition is ripeness, and it means it's usually a term used for fruits, indicating sweetness, sometimes softness. Sometimes things become soft. Often they become soft when they're ripe. They become juicy, and they usually change color. And it also, the biggest indicator is the maturity of the seeds. When the seeds become mature, meaning that if you took them out of the fruit and planted them, they would sprout. That's what mature means in that sense. When the seeds become mature, that fruit is definitely ripe. Some crops can be harvested at multiple stages. Things like beans, you can harvest them when the green beans are really young and tender. You can harvest them when the beans are larger and you're not going to eat the pod, you're going to shell. You're going to take the beans out of the pod and cook them, or you can harvest them at the dry bean stage, which means those beans are basically ready for storage. And then the cooking process is a little different if you're talking about dry beans as opposed to fresh beans. Some crops are harvested only when young and tender, right? Think of a crop like asparagus. You're not going to harvest asparagus when it gets old and leaves out. You only harvest the young, tender shoots. Also, think about a crop like a cucumber. If you leave a cucumber on the vine for too long, it'll turn yellow, the skin will get hard, and the seeds will get really hard too. And that's no good for eating. So that's one of those crops that's only harvested when it's young and tender. Some crops are harvested at senescence. So there's another vocabulary word that means when the plant starts dying. So this includes things like potatoes and then all of the dry seed crops that we talked about. And then some crops are harvested at peak size, but before they bolt. Bolting is another vocabulary word, and it means the flowering process. Now, some of you guys might already know this. So, two other things before we go on. Crops harvested when ripe, okay, so these are crops that we're waiting specifically until they're ripe, include fruits like, and some of these you might be surprised that they're fruits. So apples, pears, stone fruits, which includes cherries, plums, peaches, etc. Berries like currants and blueberries, things like that. Aggregate fruits, which are things like raspberries, blackberries, and strawberries. They're basically made up of a bunch of little fruits. Those are called aggregate fruits. Melons, grapes, tomatoes are a fruit, peppers are a fruit, winter squashes, and many others. And all of these that I just mentioned are fruits, literally speaking, botanically speaking, and they're harvested when they're ripe. You want to wait till they're ripe to harvest them. Now, some other fruiting crops are harvested at full size, but when they're tender. Okay, so these are also technically fruits, but they are harvested not when the fruit is mature, which means when the seeds are mature, but actually before that stage when they're at a good size, but they are still tender. So that's things like cucumber, eggplant, summer squashes, snap peas, snap beans, and sweet corn. Some pictures. Top left, we have apples and pears. And then on the right here, we have the stone fruits. Down here, we have our aggregate fruits, raspberries, strawberries, and blackberries. And top, we have melons. We have our winter squashes. Down below, we have berries. And then we have some of the crops that we might not think of as fruits, which are tomatoes and peppers. Also, other crops that we might not think of as fruits. And these are things that are harvested at the young tender stage. Things like snap peas, cucumbers, eggplant, and summer squash. These are all technically fruiting crops. Okay, so then unlike the crops that are harvested when they are mature and tender, these crops are harvested when they're young and tender, and include shoot crops like asparagus, squash buds, pea shoots, and various herbs, culinary herbs, are harvested. We're harvesting the shoot of the plant. Young fruits like okra, snow peas, and fillet beans. So these are harvested when they're small or when they're at a real young stage. and then baby greens and other leafy greens like arugula and baby lettuce. So these are specifically harvested when they're young and tender. The crops are grown and bred to be harvested at that specific time, and that's when you harvest them. And there's every crop is so specific. So it really requires learning each crop individually. Then you have these crops that are harvested at senescence, that big word that means when they start dying, or basically when they kind of stop growing, they reach kind of old age and they start going downhill. And what tells you when senescence is starting is the leaves start yellowing usually, and sometimes the crop starts to fall over. So on the left here, we have potatoes. You can see they're getting a little yellow. Some of the leaves are starting to turn brown a little bit, and they're starting to fall over. So these potatoes are ready to be harvested. In the middle, we have garlic, and you can see the older leaves on the garlic are turning brown and drying up. And that's telling us that that garlic is ready to be harvested. And on the right over here, we can see some storage onions. So the leaves still look pretty good, but the plants actually fall over. They lose strength in their stem right there, and the leaf part just falls over, and that's telling us that that those onions are ready to harvest. And then along with those other crops, these crops are also, we harvest at senescence. So we're talking about grains. This is barley. We're talking about grains like corn, wheat, rice, rye, all those kinds of things. And on the top, we have dry beans. This would also include other dry grains, amaranth, quinoa. We would include millet in there. We would include lentils, dry peas like split peas, a whole bunch of crops that are dry grains. And then we have our crops that are harvested at peak size, but before bolting, before going to flower. So this includes our lettuces, cabbages, and any other crops that form heads, leafy heads, as well as certain root crops like carrots, radishes, and beets. So down here you can see a picture. On the one side, we have, on the right, we have a beautiful head of lettuce that is full size. And on the left, we have a similar green leaf lettuce that is bolting. You can see that flower stalk is coming up. Now, these lettuce leaves, they might look all right, but if you taste them, they have gotten super bitter. That plant is going to seed and it's no longer at the perfect quality for eating. You could eat it, but it's not going to taste very good and it might upset your stomach a little bit. Other examples, here's a couple cabbage plants. One is at a perfect stage for harvesting. It's got that beautiful head. And then another one has already opened, that head has opened and flowered. So that cabbage went too far, too long. On the other side of the page, you can see at the bottom, you see some beautiful radishes that were harvested at the appropriate stage. And at the top, you see radishes that have started to bolt. Now, a couple things are going to happen when that radish bolts, when it sends up that tall flower stalk. You can see that the form of the radish, the form of the leaves and everything changes. It goes from all the leaves coming out of that central top of the root to having this long stalk, right? So the shape of the radish changes, of the whole plant changes. And then the stem right here, as well as the radish, will become real woody, and the flavor will change and become really bland and not be good to eat anymore. And sometimes that root will shrink down, will actually shrink, and there won't be much left to eat, even though what is there to eat is is tough and fibrous. Okay, so that was all about harvesting at the right stage. Now we want to talk about protecting the produce and the plant for a continued harvest. Now this is important for the fruiting plants, all the fruiting plants, as well as some of the other plants that we're going to continue to harvest. Not so true, or really not applicable to plants that we harvest one time. So that's root crops and head crops like lettuce and cabbage. But almost all the other crops, we're going to harvest them again and again. So we've got to take care of not only the produce, the stuff that we're harvesting, but also the plant that we're harvesting from. So right here we have asparagus, peas. Right here you can see this person is actually demonstrating one of the appropriate ways to pick peas. The trick with picking peas and green beans is you don't want to yank the pod off of the plant. You want to either have it snap off below the attachment point or right at this crook right here, right at this little elbow. But you want it to break away from the plant. You don't want to pull on it and damage the plant. Kale is being harvested here in the picture, and the leaves are being broken off, but they're being bent down so that they snap, rather than what you don't want to do is pull the leaf down and basically kind of strip the skin off of the stalk of the plant, because that will damage the plant. And then things like zucchini and other summer squashes, as well as peppers, you want to have a clean break from the mother plant. You don't want to pull it off and damage the plant. It's better to cut it or snip it. If you don't have anything else, what you can do with summer squash and zucchini is you can twist them and keep twisting until it comes off easily. Main thing is you don't want to pull the plant. You can either damage the plant or pull the whole plant out. And then you're not going to get any more food out of that plant. Okay, some more examples of proper harvesting, and it really depends. Every crop is different. So there's a proper way to harvest Swiss chard. Raspberries are super delicate, so you need to harvest them very gently and harvest them very routinely. Grapes, also another delicate soft fruit that needs to be handled with care and pruned off the plant with pruners. This woman is very happy about her Asian pears. And rhubarb. There's a proper way to harvest rhubarb. All these things, we want to take care of the plant that is providing. That way it'll keep providing for us. And then when we're talking about the one-time harvest, like all of these crops that in the pictures, we still want to protect the produce, right? So when we're harvesting carrots, harvesting them by hand so that we're not just breaking the tops off, but we can actually pull the carrot out. If we're using a fork or something to harvest our carrots, then we're not stabbing them, like in this potato picture. Same with harvesting potatoes or other root crops with a fork. We want to, in this picture, you can see how the fork is well away from where the roots would be underground. So if you see the stem part of the potato coming up, you're forking over here rather than forking right next to the stem where you're probably going to stab right into some nice potatoes. And proper harvesting of lettuce heads is being very gentle with them and cutting the base of the stem with a knife. And then these gentlemen are demonstrating proper celery harvesting. So they are cutting below all of the celery stalks and then trimming the leaves off and stacking them up properly. So picking at the correct stage, especially for continued harvest, things like green beans and peas, and to a certain extent, cucumbers, other crops too that you harvest at the mature but not ripe stage. So if you can look at these pictures, here we have green beans that are harvested at the correct stage. On the other side, we have green beans harvested at the correct stage. And in the middle, if you look closely, you can see those beans. They're showing all of the individual seeds on the inside. You can see that the pod is kind of shrunk around the seeds, and you can see each individual seed. That's usually an indicator that those beans are over mature. Now what's happened is the plant has put a whole bunch of its energy now into developing those seeds. And so that plant is kind of kicking the bucket because in that plant's world, it's already done its job. It's making mature seeds to create the next generation so it can now give up and die. Whereas if you're harvesting your green beans when they're young and tender, before the seeds develop, then it'll keep producing green beans. It'll continue to produce for much longer. So in order to prevent that, there's two things that we want to do. We want to harvest very regularly, which usually means like every few days. And we want to harvest very thoroughly, which means when you go to the green bean patch, you're getting every green bean that's ready. And then you're coming back 3 days later and getting every green bean that's ready. And if you do that every few days, every 3 days or so, not only are you going to get a lot more food every harvest time, every harvest day that you do it, but you're also going to get more harvests. It's going to carry on for longer. Thorough, consistent harvest of fruit and crops increases the life of the plant and reduces pests. Okay, so even with crops that we harvest at a mature stage, like the grapes and the tomatoes that we harvest, at the ripe stage, like grapes and tomatoes, doing a thorough harvest and making sure that there aren't animals or pests getting to those crops before we do, making sure that there's not fruit rotting on the ground, all those things will attract pests and disease. And being thorough about our harvest and collecting everything, that will increase the lifespan of the plant and reduce pests and disease. Okay, so lastly is kind of some general things about being smart, practical, and efficient about our harvesting. Now, what that means is there's an art to harvesting. So we want to try to master our eye to see ripeness. We want to know what it looks like when that green bean is at the perfect stage, or at that cherry, or that asparagus, or that head of lettuce. We want to know when that particular crop is at ripeness or maturity. It's at the perfect stage to harvest. We want to do complete harvests of fruit crops on a regular basis. So that means every few days. So again, being real thorough, getting everything that's ready and doing that every few days. We want to balance care for the produce and plants with speed. So the way I like to put this is first focus on doing the job right? Harvesting that crop properly, taking proper care to not damage the produce and to not damage the plant. And then once you get that technique down, then try to speed up a little bit. Then see how quickly you can harvest that whole crop. See if you can beat your record from 3 days before. There's in-harvest and post-harvest care of produce. So this is super important. Every crop has different things that it needs to be protected from damage. So we talked about raspberries being really delicate. When we harvest raspberries, we never put more than 2 layers of raspberries in a container. You're not going to pack them into a big bowl because the ones at the bottom are going to get smushed. Apples bruise, so you're never going to toss your apples, you're always going to place them. There's so many examples of this. Head lettuce, right? They can be damaged, they can be crushed. but then we also want to think about temperature and sunlight. So when we're harvesting, we want to have places where we can put our crops in the shade. So we haven't done all this work harvesting our beautiful heads of lettuce, and then we're leaving them out in the sun for an hour while we finish harvesting the whole bed. And then when we get back to the first ones, they're all droopy and look horrible. So that's in harvest care. And then post harvest, same thing. If our crop that we just harvested needs to get cold right away, then we're on top of that. If it needs to get in the shade, if it needs to get sprayed with a hose to keep it nice and damp, then we're on top of all those things. Thinking ahead. So when we're harvesting, depending on what we're doing with that crop, we might treat it differently. So for instance, if we're harvesting heads of lettuce and they're going to get moved around a bunch before they get to the farm stand in the front of the school, or before they get home, maybe we want to leave those not so nice outer leaves on there to protect the inner ones. Because if you take off the outer leaves right away, that next layer is going to get bruised in transport. There's a lot of other things when it comes to marketing and presentation of produce, where how we harvest can make the difference if something looks beautiful or if it looks like it had a rough ride. Last thing, best part, taste testing is super important. The only way that you get the first thing on this list, mastering your eye for proper ripeness and maturity, the only way you get there is by tasting things. So when you're harvesting your peas, if you're still learning, you want to look. You're not just eating to eat, you're eating to learn, right? So you're looking at that pea and you're like, I think that's the right stage to harvest the pea. You're going to taste it. And then further down the line, you're like, what if I let them get a little bit bigger? And then you taste that and you're like, oh, that one's actually sweeter. I'm going to let these peas get a little bit bigger. I've been harvesting them too young. So you want to constantly be tasting your produce and getting feedback. Right. And so I believe this is the last. This is a perfect example of handling. So green beans are a perfect example of staying on top of continuous harvest and how much more food you get out of a green bean patch when you are harvesting them regularly and thoroughly. And then tomatoes are a perfect example of harvesting things at the peak ripeness and then properly handling them, right? Because they are very delicate. Okay, so to review, we want to always think about these things when we're harvesting, okay? We want to harvest at the right time. We need to learn how to judge maturity of the crop, ripeness, tenderness, etc. We want to protect the produce and the plant for continued harvest. And for a continued harvest, we need to pick at the correct stage every few days. That usually means preventing that mature seed formation, right? Harvesting before those mature seeds form. That way we can extend the life of our crop. And we want to remember all those little things about being practical and efficient. Okay, I hope you guys are excited to get out and start harvesting.